1 hour before the wedding, I heard my son tell his fiancée, "Tomorrow, everything will be mine. The old fool thinks I love him." I just smiled in silence. The moment the ceremony ended, my sweet revenge began. If this story resonates with you, subscribe to the channel and share in the comments which city you're watching from. We'd love to know where our community is growing. My name is Esteban Cruz. I'm 72 years old, and I've run Cruz Auto in the city for 40 years. I built it from nothing. I started with a small lot and 3 used cars in 1988. That Saturday morning started like any important day in our family with coffee. Real coffee, French roast with just a touch of cinnamon. Carlos had spent the night at the house before his wedding. Old tradition. The groom shouldn't see the bride before the ceremony. I was excited, probably more excited than I'd been in years. My boy was finally settling down with Isabel, a sweet dental hygienist who treated me with genuine respect. I made an extra strong pot of coffee that morning, thinking Carlos might need the caffeine for his wedding nerves. I poured 2 cups, his in his favorite soccer team's mug, and mine in my old world's best dad mug. The house was quiet as I went up the stairs. The wooden steps creaked the same way they had for 28 years. Carlos's door was closed, but I could hear his voice through the wood. He was on the phone talking loud and animatedly, like he always did when he was excited about something. I stopped outside his door with the coffee tray in both hands about to knock. That was when I heard him say it. "Man, you aren't going to believe this. The dumb old man is actually going to sign over the whole dealership today. 40 years of work, and he thinks I give a damn." My hands went numb, the coffee cups vibrated against the wooden tray, but I managed to hold them. Through the door, Carlos's voice continued clear as day. "I've been playing the perfect son for years, bro. All those family dinners, all those yes, Dad. And thank you, Dad. It's finally paying off. Cruz Auto, the house. It'll all be mine after I say I do." Carlos laughed. That same laugh I used to love when he was a kid, now twisted into something cruel. The pathetic old man has no idea. He thinks I respect him. He thinks I'm grateful. Hell, he probably thinks I'll take care of him in his old age. What a joke. I stood there in that hallway gripping that coffee tray like it was the only thing keeping me on my feet. 40 years of 16-hour days, of missing Carlos's baseball games to pay for his college, of working myself nearly to death to leave him something meaningful. All dismissed as the foolishness of a pathetic old man. "Trust me, Miguel," Carlos continued. "By tonight, I'll own everything, and the dumb old man will be so happy thinking he's helped me start my new life. It's like taking candy from a baby." I don't know how long I stood there. It could have been seconds. It could have been minutes. All I know is that something inside me, something that had been soft and trusting for 72 years, turned to stone. Silently, carefully, I went back down those creaky stairs, left the coffee tray on the kitchen table, and sat in my usual chair. The coffee got cold while I sat there, trying to process what I'd just heard. My son, my only son, the boy I'd raised alone after Marta died. He thought I was a dumb and pathetic old man. But here's the thing about us dumb old men. Sometimes we're smarter than our kids think. Esteban Cruz had built an empire in 40 years. Now I had one day to decide what to do with it. Carlos skipped down the stairs with his hair messed up from sleep, wearing that easy smile that used to make my heart swell with pride. "Good morning, Dad. Something smells amazing." I forced what I hoped looked like a normal smile. 40 years of business negotiations had taught me to hide my thoughts, but this was different. This was my son, and every instinct screamed at me to confront him right there. Instead, I pointed to the breakfast I'd made. "Scrambled eggs, just how you like them." "Hey." Carlos slid into his usual chair, the same spot where I'd helped him with homework, where we talked about his dreams of taking over the family business. Now I knew exactly what that dream meant to him. "You didn't have to go to so much trouble," he said, attacking the eggs. "I know today's going to be crazy." "No trouble at all." I poured orange juice into his glass, the same one I'd bought him at 16. Everything held memories, now stained by his words upstairs. Carlos babbled about the day ahead. The photographer at 10, the flowers being delivered, how nervous Isabel probably was. He thanked me for the catering, the reception hall, everything you've done to make this day perfect. Every word of gratitude felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I watched him eat my food in my house, getting ready for his wedding, which I was paying for, knowing he saw me as nothing more than a dumb old man. You know what, Dad? Carlos looked up with those brown eyes so much like his mother's. I've been thinking about how lucky I'm to have you. The irony was suffocating. Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, you could have retired years ago, moved to a fancy residential area, played golf every day, but you stayed. You kept the business going. You made sure I had something to build on. I turned to the sink before he could see my expression. I just wanted to take care of my boy. And you did, Dad. You really did. The worst part was he sounded sincere. Maybe Carlos had convinced himself that using me was somehow the same as loving me. I should start getting ready, he said, getting up and taking his plate to the counter. Before I could pull away, he wrapped me in one of those bear hugs he'd been giving me since childhood. Thanks for everything, Dad. You're the best father a guy could ask for. I stood there with my arms around my son, feeling like my heart was being crushed, and managed to pat his back like nothing had changed. Better get moving then. I've got some last-minute wedding details to handle. Carlos went up the stairs whistling. The moment his bedroom door closed, I went into my study and took out my phone. While Carlos finished a shower and got ready for what he thought would be the best day of his life, Esteban Cruz made 3 phone calls that'd change everything. The ceremony was everything a father dreams of for his son. St. Mary's Cathedral looked magnificent with white roses cascading down every pew. The afternoon sunlight came through the stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns on the marble floor. I stood at the back of the church watching 300 guests take their seats. Family, friends, business partners who knew Carlos since he was little. They all saw what I used to see. A successful family, a proud father, a young man ready to build his own legacy. When the music started, I walked Carlos down that long aisle. With his mother gone, it was my honor and my heartbreak, all in one moment. Carlos's hand rested on my arm, firm and confident, while mine shook slightly with emotions I couldn't name anymore. Are you ready for this, son? I whispered as we approached the altar. More than ready, Dad. Thanks for getting me here. I placed his hand in Isabel's and took a step back, watching as Father Martinez began the ceremony. Isabel looked radiant in her grandmother's wedding dress, her dark eyes shining with pure joy. This girl genuinely loved my son. That was clear in every look, in every smile she gave him. The vows were beautiful. Carlos promised to honor and cherish Isabel, to be her partner in all things, to build a life based on love and trust. The words sounded sincere coming out of his mouth, and maybe in that moment they were. Isabel's vows brought tears to half the congregation. She talked about finding her soulmate, about the family she was gaining, about how grateful she was to have me as a father-in-law. When she looked at me during that part, I saw nothing but honest affection. This sweet girl had no idea what kind of man she was marrying. The reception at the country club was flawless. Carlos had insisted on keeping it classy, but not too expensive, which I now understood differently. The band played, people danced, and everyone commented on what a perfect couple they made. Then came the speeches. Carlos stood up with his champagne glass, looking like the grateful sun in every inch. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight, but most of all, I need to thank my father. The room went quiet, all eyes turning to me. I felt my chest tighten. My dad has given me everything. His business wisdom, his work ethic, his unconditional love. After Mom died, he became both parents to me. He sacrificed his own dreams to make sure I had every opportunity. Applause filled the room. People nodded, smiling at me with admiration. Carlos raised his glass higher. Dad, everything good in my life comes from you. The business that'll support my family, the values that guide me, the example of what it means to be a man. I can only hope to be half the father to my kids that you've been to me. The standing ovation was thunderous. Carlos came over and hugged me in front of everyone, and I had to smile and nod while my soul died inside. During the father-daughter dance with Isabel, she whispered in my ear, "Thanks for raising such a wonderful man, Dad. I promise I'll take good care of him, and I promise I'll take care of you too, sweetheart." I replied, feeling every word. Whatever happened next, Isabel didn't deserve to get caught in the crossfire. As the night ended and the guests started to leave, I excused myself to make one last phone call. While Carlos and Isabel said their goodbyes, I went into the club's business center and dialed a number I'd memorized that morning. Jimenez and Associates Law Firm. How can we help you? This is Esteban Cruz. I need to schedule an emergency meeting for Monday morning. Carlos walked into Cruz Auto that Monday morning like he owned the place, which in his mind he was about to. He was whistling some tune from the wedding reception with his car keys jingling, looking like a man without a care in the world. Good morning, Dad. Ready to make this official? I'd been at the dealership since 6 a.m., making sure everything was perfect. The conference room was prepped, the documents ready, and lawyer Jimenez was already reviewing the paperwork I spent Sunday finalizing. The conference room is ready, I said, pointing toward the glass-walled office where Jimenez was sitting with his briefcase open. Carlos's step faltered. Conference room. I thought we'd just sign the transfer papers in your office. This is a significant business transaction, son. Better to do it properly. We went into the conference room, where Jimenez stood up to greet us. The mahogany table was covered with official documents, each page marked with colored tabs. This wasn't the simple signing session Carlos expected. Mr. Cruz Jr., Jimenez said, shaking Carlos's hand. Your father has prepared a rather comprehensive ownership transition plan. Carlos looked at me, then at the mountain of papers. Comprehensive. Please have a seat. Jimenez opened the first folder. Your father has structured this as a probationary ownership agreement. Probationary? Carlos's voice cracked on the word. Jimenez adjusted his glasses and read from the document. The transfer of the Cruz Auto dealership will be subject to a 6-month evaluation period, during which the prospective owner must demonstrate a genuine respect for the business, its employees, and its founding principles. I watched Carlos's face as he took in the words. His confident smile was fading fast. Furthermore, Jimenez continued, the candidate must exhibit an authentic work ethic, personal integrity, and commitment to the family legacy. What does that mean exactly? Carlos's hands were flat on the table, leaning forward. It means, I said quietly, that you've got 6 months to prove you deserve what I've spent 40 years building. Jimenez turned to the next page. If the probationary period results in failure, the ownership of Cruz Auto, including all assets and investments, will be transferred to the city's Children's Foundation. The color drained from Carlos's face. Charity? You'd give it to charity? The foundation does excellent work with underprivileged kids, I replied. Kids who could actually appreciate what they're given. Carlos stared at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. Dad, we talked about this. You said after the wedding. I said a lot of things, Carlos, but I've been thinking about what it means to earn something versus expecting it to be handed to you on a silver platter. Jimenez cleared his throat. The terms are clear. 6 months of demonstrated character, work ethic, and genuine respect. Weekly evaluations. Monthly progress reports. Final evaluation. And if I don't do it, Carlos's voice was barely a whisper. Then you'll learn a valuable lesson about taking things for granted. I said. Carlos looked at me with an expression I'd never seen, like he was seeing me for the first time. The confident young man who'd walked in 20 minutes ago was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood his father wasn't the pushover he thought. The probationary period starts today, Jimenez announced. Your father will be your supervisor, mentor, and, ultimately, your judge. Carlos sat there in stunned silence, staring at the contract that'd make him a man or teach him what it feels like to lose everything. For 40 years, I've been playing the long game. Now, it was Carlos's turn to learn the rules. The moment lawyer Jimenez's footsteps faded down the hallway, Carlos exploded. What the hell is this, Dad? He shot up from his chair, slamming his hands on the conference table. 6 months. Probation. Are you crazy? I sat there with my fingers calmly laced together, watching my son fall apart. 40 years in business had taught me that the person who loses control first loses everything. Are you upset? I said calmly. Upset. Carlos started pacing back and forth, running his hands through his hair. We had a deal. You said after the wedding the business would be mine. We shook on it. I agreed. But that was before I knew what you really thought of our deal. Carlos stopped pacing. Something in my tone finally reached him. What are you talking about? Sit down, Carlos. I don't want to sit down. I want to know why suddenly you're treating me like a stranger off the street instead of your own son. I stood up slowly. I walked to the window overlooking the showroom floor where customers looked at the new models. 40 years building this from nothing, and my own son saw it only as something to snatch away. You know what hurts the most? I said, still looking out the window. It isn't that you don't appreciate what I've built. It's that you think I'm too stupid to see right through you. Dad, I don't know what you're. The dumb old man is going to sign everything today. 40 years of work, and he thinks I really give a damn. The silence behind me was deafening. I could practically hear Carlos's heart stop. I turned around to face him. Sound familiar? Carlos's face had gone as white as a sheet of paper. Dad, can I explain? I've been playing the good son for years, and it's finally paying off. I took a step closer. Your exact words, Carlos, to your friend Miguel. Saturday morning, an hour before your wedding, you were listening to my private conversation. I was bringing you coffee. My voice was steady, but inside I was trembling with 40 years of repressed pain. Just like I've been bringing you coffee and dinner and opportunities and love your whole life, while you saw me as nothing more than a pathetic old man. Carlos tried to save it. Dad, I was just venting. You know how guys talk? No. I cut him off. Don't you dare minimize this. You call me dumb, Carlos. You laughed about manipulating me. You told your friend it was almost too easy to take advantage of your own father. He opened his mouth to argue, but I wasn't done. You want to know what's really pathetic? For 37 years, I convinced myself that your taking was actually love. Every time you needed money for car repairs, rent, or some emergency that somehow always happened right before you got paid, I told myself I was being a good dad. Carlos's shoulders slumped. Dad, please, but you weren't taking because you needed help. You were taking because you thought I was too stupid to say no. That isn't true, isn't it? I pulled out my phone and showed him the call log. Saturday morning, 6:47 a.m. Do you want me to call Miguel and ask him what you said about your unsuspecting, pathetic old man? Carlos stared at the phone like it was a loaded gun. Here's what's going to happen, I said, putting the phone away. You've got 6 months to prove you aren't the entitled kid I accidentally raised. 6 months to show me you can work for something instead of just expecting it handed to you. And if I can't, then you'll learn what it feels like to lose everything you never really earned in the first place. For the first time in his life, Carlos Cruz had no safety net and no backup plan and no one to blame but himself. The next morning, Carlos walked into Cruz Auto, looking like he'd been put through a blender. His usually perfect hair was messy. His wrinkled shirt and dark circles under his eyes told me he hadn't slept. That night, I asked, watching him pour himself coffee with shaking hands. He looked into his cup before looking up with something I'd never seen in his eyes. Genuine fear. Isabel and I had a fight about the business agreement. Carlos nodded, slumping into the chair across from my desk. She wanted to know why you changed your mind so suddenly. I tried to explain you were being irrational, but she kept pressing for details. You know Isabel's smart as a whip? She doesn't let things go. I leaned back, studying my son. So what did you tell her? The truth. The words seemed to physically hurt him. About the phone call, what I told Miguel. How did she take it? Carlos's laugh was bitter. She looked at me like I was a stranger who'd broken into her house to rob it. She asked how she could trust me if that's how I treat my own father. She said if I could make fun of you behind your back, what would I say about her? When it was convenient, that hit me in the chest. Isabel had seen straight to the heart of the matter in a way that probably cut Carlos deeper than anything I could have said. She made me sleep on a couch. Carlos continued with his voice barely a whisper. Second night of marriage, Dad. She wouldn't even look at me this morning. I saw my son finally facing consequences, not just with me, but with the woman he claimed to love. For the first time since Saturday, I felt something other than anger, a small seed of hope that maybe this was the wake-up call he needed. What are you going to do about it? Carlos turned away with tears in his eyes. I don't know. She said she needs time to think about what kind of man she married. What if she decides she made a mistake? Then you'll learn what it costs to take the people who love you for granted. Dad, please, I can't lose her too. Then maybe it's time you start proving you deserve to keep her. Carlos looked at me, and I could see his gears turning. Maybe for the first time in his adult life, he was understanding that actions have consequences and charm couldn't fix everything. The 6 months he finally said, "If I do this, if I prove myself to you, will you help me fix things with Isabel?" "Son, the only person who can fix things with Isabel is you. But proving you can change might be a good place to start." For the first time since this mess started, Carlos Cruz was completely alone with the consequences of his choices. 2 weeks later, I watched from my office window as Carlos walked across the Cruz auto sales floor for his first real day of work. Hundreds. In 37 years, my son had never sold a car. He'd hung around the dealership during summers actually, done some filing, answered phones occasionally, but never faced a customer who didn't know he was the boss's son. Today that changed. I'd instructed my sales manager, Pedro Rodriguez, to treat Carlos like any other new employee, no special favors, no easy customers, no safety net. If Carlos was going to prove himself worthy of this business, he needed to start from the bottom. From my vantage point, overlooking the showroom, I saw Carlos approach his first customer, a middle-aged woman looking at our certified pre-owned section. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see her body language change from interested to skeptical to downright annoyed in 5 minutes. She walked away without even taking a business card. Customer number 2 lasted about 3 minutes before heading straight to Pedro's desk. By lunch, Carlos had struck out with 6 potential buyers. I watched him sit alone in the break room, staring at a sandwich he wasn't eating, looking like a man who just found out he wasn't as smart as he thought. "How's the kid doing?" Pedro asked, appearing at my door. "About as well as you'd expect from someone who's never had to work for anything in his life." Pedro nodded grimly. "The guys are watching him pretty carefully. They're polite, but nobody is exactly rolling out the red carpet for him. Word gets around, they heard about the probation thing." It didn't surprise me. In a dealership this size, news traveled fast. My employees had watched Carlos coast through life on my generosity for years. Now they were curious to see if he'd actually step up when it mattered. The afternoon brought more of the same. Carlos's confidence, the easy charm that had carried him through life, crumbled against the reality of customers who didn't care who his father was. They wanted someone who understood their needs, who knew the product, who could earn their trust through competence instead of connections. Then, around 4 o'clock, something changed. I saw Carlos approach an older gentleman who'd been wandering the lot for 20 minutes, looking lost and overwhelmed. Instead of launching into his usual sales pitch, Carlos simply asked, "Can I help you find something, sir?" The conversation lasted almost an hour. I couldn't hear from my office, but I could see Carlos listening more than talking, nodding occasionally, pointing out features on different vehicles. When they finally shook hands, the old man was smiling. Carlos walked the customer over to Pedro's desk to handle the paperwork. Then he went back to the sales floor with something I hadn't seen on his face in 2 weeks. Genuine satisfaction. After closing time, I found him in the break room, still looking stunned by his success. "Rough day?" I asked. "Mr. Hernandez, that's the gentleman who bought the Escape SUV. He reminded me of Grandpa Jose." Carlos looked at me with tired but clearer eyes. He just wanted someone to listen to what he really needed instead of trying to sell him the most expensive thing on the lot. And what did he need? Reliability, safety features for his wife, something that wouldn't break down when they drive to visit their grandkids in the capital. Carlos paused. "I actually cared about helping him, Dad. Not just making the sale, but making sure he got the right car." For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of pride in my son. "That's the difference between selling cars and serving customers," I said. Carlos nodded slowly. "I'm starting to understand that. I've got a lot to learn." With 3 months left, Carlos was starting to understand the difference between inheriting a business and earning it. The 4th month brought the kind of crisis that could destroy a dealership's reputation overnight. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning. Mrs. Patricia Gonzalez, who'd bought a used SUV from us 3 weeks prior, was threatening to sue. The vehicle had broken down on the highway with her 2 young grandkids in the back seat during the brutal July heat. The tow truck, the emergency repair, the trauma for the kids. She wanted Cruz Auto to pay for everything plus damages for selling a death trap. I watched from my office as Carlos took the call, his face turning pale as Mrs. Gonzalez's voice got loud enough for me to hear it through the phone. When he hung up, his hands were shaking. Within an hour, the crisis escalated. Mrs. Gonzalez had called the Channel 12 News. A reporter was already asking questions about our inspection process. Social media posts were starting to pop up with pictures of the broken-down SUV and angry comments about greedy dealerships that don't care about customer safety. Carlos burst into my office without knocking something he hadn't done since he was 12. "Dad, we got a problem, a big one." I pointed to the chair in front of my desk. "Tell me." He explained the situation in quick, panicked sentences, his usual composure completely gone. "The reporter wants a statement by 5 o'clock. Mrs. Gonzalez is talking about calling a lawyer. If this gets on the evening news, what's your plan?" I asked calmly. "My plan?" Carlos looked at me like I'd asked him to perform brain surgery. "Dad, I don't have a plan. I'm in way over my head. What if we lose customers? What if other people start claiming their cars are defective? What if Carlos?" I raised my hand. "Stop, breathe." He took a shaky breath, but his eyes were still wide with panic. "In 40 years, I've handled dozens of situations like this," I said. "The first rule is don't make decisions when you're scared. Fear makes you stupid. So what do? For a moment, I considered stepping in and handling it myself. It would have been easier, faster, and probably more effective, but that wouldn't have taught Carlos anything, except that Daddy would always be there to clean up his messes. "What do you think you should do?" "I don't know. Call our lawyer, deny everything, offer her money to go away. Those are all defensive moves. How about we go on the offensive?" Carlos frowned, his panic slowly being replaced by focus. "What do you mean? How about we fix this before she has to ask us to?" I saw the gears turning in his head. "You mean fix the problem instead of fighting over whose fault it is? Now you're thinking like a businessman instead of reacting like a scared kid." For the next 4 hours, Carlos and I worked together for the first time in years. We reviewed the SUV's service history, contacted our mechanic to understand exactly what had failed, and developed a plan that went way beyond what Mrs. Gonzalez was demanding. Carlos called her personally to apologize, not just for the breakdown, but for the fear she and her grandkids had experienced. We offered to cover all her expenses, provide a comparable replacement vehicle while hers was being repaired, and implement additional safety inspections for all our used vehicles. When the Channel 12 reporter called for our statement, Carlos was ready. Instead of making excuses, he acknowledged the problem, explained our solution, and turned a potential disaster into a story about a family business that stands behind its customers. "Dad," Carlos said as we watched the 6 o'clock news present our story in a surprisingly positive light, "I couldn't have done this without you." "Yes, you could have. You just needed to stop panicking long enough to think clearly, but I didn't know how to think clearly. That's what I needed your help with." For the first time in years, father and son had worked together to build something more valuable than any business: trust. 6 months after the day Carlos had walked into my office expecting to inherit everything, we sat in Lawyer Jimenez's conference room for the final evaluation. The same mahogany table, the same leather chairs, but everything else had changed. Carlos sat next to Isabel, their hands intertwined, a sight that warmed my heart more than I wanted to admit. The tension that had driven them to separate rooms was gone, replaced by something stronger. Isabel looked at her husband with genuine pride, the kind that comes from watching someone you love become the person you always hoped they could be. "Mr. Cruz," Jimenez began opening his file. "We're here to review Carlos's performance during his 6-month probationary period and issue your final decision regarding the ownership transfer of Cruz Auto." I looked across the table at my son. The arrogant young man who'd mocked me as a dumb old man was gone. In his place sat someone who'd learned what it meant to earn respect, to work for something instead of expecting it handed to him. "Carlos," I said before making my decision, "I'd like to hear from you. What VE you learned these past 6 months?" Carlos sat up straighter in his chair, looking me right in the eyes. "I learned I was everything you probably thought I was. Spoiled, entitled, ungrateful. I took your love for granted and mistook your generosity for weakness." Isabel squeezed his hand encouragingly. "I learned that running a business isn't about ownership. It's about service to the customers, to the employees, to the community. I learned that respect isn't inherited, it's earned every day. Carlos's voice grew stronger. But most importantly, Dad, I learned what it means to have a father who loved me enough to let me fail so I could finally learn how to succeed. I felt my throat close up with the emotion I'd been holding back for months. The Carlos who walked into this office 6 months ago would have destroyed everything I spent 40 years building. I said, not out of malice, but out of ignorance. He didn't understand that this business isn't just about selling cars. It's about trust, integrity, and taking care of people. I stood up and walked to the window, looking at the city skyline, where the Cruise Auto sign was visible in the distance. But the Carlos, sitting here today, has proven something I wasn't sure I'd ever see. He's proven he understands that leadership is about serving others, not being served, that success comes from lifting people up, not looking down on them. I turned to face my son. Carlos, you've shown me you aren't the entitled kid I accidentally raised, but the man I always hoped you could become. Carlos's eyes filled with tears. That means Jimenez, prepare the final transfer documents. My son has earned his inheritance. The relief on Carlos's face was only matched by the joy on Isabel's. She threw her arms around her husband, whispering congratulations through her own tears. While Jimenez prepared the paperwork, Carlos walked over to me. Dad, I know I can never undo what I said, what I thought of you, but I want you to know that everything I'm now, everything good in me comes from you. No, son, everything good in you is always there. You just needed to find it. We signed the papers as the afternoon sun came through the conference room windows. Cruise Auto officially belonged to Carlos, but more importantly, I got my son back. That night, as we celebrated with dinner at Isabel's favorite restaurant, Carlos raised his glass to my father, who taught me that the greatest inheritance isn't money or property, it's character. As I looked around the table at my son and daughter-in-law, I realized Carlos was right about one thing. The dumb old man had been listening the whole time, and sometimes that's exactly what a father needs to do. Looking back on this journey, I've learned that sometimes the people we love the most are the ones who disappoint us the most. But I've also learned that betrayal stories like mine don't have to end in bitterness. They can become stories of transformation instead. God has a way of using our darkest moments to teach us the most valuable lessons. When I heard Carlos's words that Saturday morning, I could have responded with anger and revenge. Instead, the Lord gave me wisdom to respond with tough love and accountability. This true story taught me that true love sometimes means letting people face consequences. Carlos needed to learn that respect isn't inherited. It's earned through character and hard work. Betrayal stories often reveal who people really are, but they can also reveal who they're capable of becoming. God works through our pain to create purpose. My son's cruel words became the catalyst for his transformation into the man I always hoped he'd be. This true story proves that even the deepest family wounds can heal when we choose growth over resentment. The greatest inheritance I could give Carlos wasn't my business. It was teaching him to become a man of integrity. Sometimes being a good father means being willing to break your son's heart to save his soul. Betrayal stories like this remind us that redemption is always possible, even in our darkest family moments. If this true story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose tough love over easy forgiveness? Don't forget to subscribe to hear more real-life stories that prove families can overcome anything when love leads the way.